of endocrine disruptors. So these are things that we may not commonly think about, but it's become increasingly important, as Megan will discuss. So we'll save hopefully a few minutes for questions at the end. Megan, thank you for leading us in this again, and I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So I'm Megan Laszlo. I'm an oncology dietitian with the Patient and Family Support Program at Cedars Sinai Cancer. And today I want to specifically talk about how to limit exposure to endocrine disruptors in the kitchen. This is kind of a continuation from our last talk on phytoestrogens. And so at our last session, we spoke about how there are exogenous estrogens. Those are estrogens that are introduced to the body that come from outside. They could be from foods like soybeans or from industrial chemicals. And so endocrine disruptors are a type of exogenous estrogen. Some of them act as xenoestrogens, which means that they can bind to estrogen receptors in the body. And so basically what endocrine disrupting chemicals are is it's a broad term for many different types of chemicals that are hormonally active, meaning that they can bind to or activate various hormone receptors and mimic the action of these hormones in the body. This means that they can interfere with the synthesis, transport, metabolism, and elimination of hormones. And this is important because hormones play a critical role in so many biologic functions. And so what do we know about the effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals? We know that they can interfere with reproduction. They can contribute to low sperm counts, poor semen quality, infertility, as well as early puberty in girls, which is a risk factor for breast cancer. They're also associated with an increased risk of not only hormonal dependent cancers like breast and prostate, but also non-hormone dependent cancers like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They've been known to cause disturbances in the immune and nervous system, and some of them are deemed to be obesogenic, meaning that they can promote weight gain, slow weight loss, and also cause increased fat tissue in the body. And so what are these chemicals? Where do we find them? There are many different types, and some of the ones listed here are the chemical name, whereas other ones are the broad group of chemicals. And we can see some of the different products that they're found in, things like pesticides that are used on produce and in farming, food contact materials, detergents, cleaning supplies. I'm sure you've heard of some of these before or seen them labeled on some foods. This is not an exhaustive list, but it helps give you an idea of where these are coming from. And so how do we gain exposure to these endocrine disrupting chemicals? We know that exposure comes from inhalation, and this could be from air pollution or from dust in the environment. Also from food or food packaging materials that migrate into our food. They can also be absorbed in the skin from cleaning supplies or from personal care products like lotion. And this might start to make you feel kind of alarmed, but I want to note that we can't control every chemical that we come into contact with, but I think that we can make informed decisions about what we eat, what we drink, what we choose to bring into our home, and what we decide to keep or throw away that is in our home. And so I want to use this time to help make some informed decisions about that. I also want to acknowledge that choice is a privilege, which is why I do want to touch on policy. And I think policy in this area is very important. And I also want to acknowledge that there's no direct known benefit of avoidance of all endocrine disrupting chemicals. So that's still something that's being better understood. Additionally, there are non-chemical endocrine disruptors, and these include things like artificial light at night, shift work, radiation, high temperatures, and also chronic stress. And those can have impacts on the endocrine system as well. And some additional considerations for this topic. I feel like it's such a big topic, it almost needs to have a few disclaimers before it, but there are over 4,000 different chemicals that are considered endocrine disrupting. And there's a large variety of exposure. As you can see, it can come from packaging, from the water, from the air, from the environment. So that we're being exposed to these in different ways. And the window of exposure appears to be important as well. These appear to have a greater impact on developing bodies in the neonatal period, in children, in adolescents. And what's really interesting about these is they don't follow the typical linear dose relationship where the dose makes the poison. Like there's a certain threshold that you can be exposed to and it's okay, but if you go over that threshold, it's suddenly problematic. These don't follow that relationship because what's been identified is that even low doses can cause health impacts, especially during critical periods of growth and development. And this is an emerging topic. We like to choose emerging, interesting topics for these talks. And I want to also just acknowledge that there are many complex factors that contribute to cancer development specifically. But I think this is something to pay attention to. And it really comes down to individual choice. I think we want to think about limiting exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals as we're able to. So let's touch on policy just for a second. There are basically two regulatory bodies in the US that have a governance over endocrine disrupting chemicals. One is the FDA. They are in charge of food additives, drugs, cosmetics, and the other is the EPA, and they oversee pesticides and commercial chemicals. But in the US, chemicals don't have to be shown to be safe prior to marketing. So even though the EPA is required to do this risk-based review of chemicals in commerce, they don't have to be shown to be safe. And this doesn't include any endocrine disrupting chemical testing or labeling. And so basically what the US does is this game of whack-a-mole where chemicals are put into manufacturing and then they have to be shown to be problematic or have detrimental health effects before they're pulled or regulated. The FDA is responsible for food packaging and food contact materials. And basically food additives are exempted from regulation if they're generally recognized as safe. It's been critiqued that there are no requirements to determine if something is GRAS or not. And we know that endocrine disrupting chemicals like BPA, triclosan, and phthalates are intentionally and legally used in food contact materials. And then in California, we have our Proposition 65, which requires labeling for products that reach certain thresholds that are known to cause cancer or reproductive harm. They also don't require listing of endocrine disrupting chemicals. I will acknowledge that in the European Union, endocrine disrupting chemicals are banned from pesticides, and they do have tighter regulation, but they do continue to have certain chemicals of concern and use. Additionally, there's an economic burden to the presence of these chemicals in our food and our environment as well. And I'll talk more about this, but policy and regulatory standards are catching up to the science of this, but for now, the burden of avoidance is really on the consumer. So before diving into different ways to limit exposure to EDCs in the kitchen, I also want to acknowledge that there are cancer risk reduction guidelines from the American Institute for Cancer Research and the World Cancer Research Fund. These are slightly different than some of the other ones that you'll see from other oncology health organizations, but I think that this should be the first step and something to really pay attention to, because we know that multiple large cohort studies have demonstrated that adherence to these guidelines has been shown to reduce cancer risk. So I think there's a benefit to especially prioritizing these guidelines and then consider some of the following things that we're going to talk about for potential added protection, and also environmental stewardship and other reasons. Okay, so how do we reduce exposure in our kitchens? Because I do want to stay in the nutrition and food preparation wheelhouse. I'm not intending to talk about cosmetics today. So we want to talk about a different recommendation, the reason why, some of the policy behind it, and then what to do instead. So we want to think about limiting exposure to agricultural chemicals. Why? Because this limits exposure to glyphosate, which is Roundup, chlorpyrifos, atrazine. Chlorpyrifos is an insecticide that's been used in crops and bug spray, and the EPA is taking steps to ban this. Atrazine carries the same issues that we've been talking about. It's associated with reproductive dysfunction, behavioral abnormalities, birth defects. And we know that these chemicals can cause ecological harm and are also associated with declines in the butterfly and bee population. And many are listed as probably carcinogenic, possibly carcinogenic, or fall under the Prop 65 guidelines. And so how do we reduce exposure to agricultural chemicals in our homes? We want to think about choosing USDA organic, which has limitations on the pesticides that can be used. I think it's worth considering growing your own food, even if it's a few herbs, something to supplement your food supply. I think can be really rewarding as well. And also, even with conventional and organic produce, you want to rinse it before you prepare it. This helps remove some pesticides. It does help remove some bacteria, and something you should be doing. So moving on to PFAS, which stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These have been in the news a lot. They're often referred to as forever chemicals because they don't break down. Most of the most studied ones are PFOA and PFOS. And these are basically barrier chemicals that are made in resistant coatings. So they're made to resist oil, water, stains. So think about stain-resistant furniture, the coatings and packaging. And they end up in the environment and in the groundwater when products are discarded or through manufacturing. So how do we limit exposure to these? One is we can limit fast food that uses PFAS in the lining of the containers. You want to think about the to-go food containers that use this as well. Microwave popcorn, which I think some folks are kind of familiar with. Filtering our tap water, which we're going to talk more about water, and avoiding Teflon or nonstick cookware. So in 2013, manufacturers started to phase out the PHOAs in Teflon, but they still use other PFAS for the nonstick coating. So we want to limit exposure to PFAS for that reason, and what's been determined from the EPA is that there's no safe level in the drinking water. And the EPA has been in the news a lot for this because they've been proposing new rules to test and limit PFAS in the water supply starting earlier this year. So testing is increasing, and then the different types of PFAS that are being tested for has expanded. And this is because nearly 100% of people that have been tested for PFAS test positive for it in their blood. And so earlier, I believe it was the end of last year, there was a $50 billion in funding for the bipartisan infrastructure law that was in part to address drinking water contaminants. And we know that drinking water is a key route of exposure for PFAS. Additionally, in California, there's the Assembly Bill 1200, and this requires that cookware companies list PFAS on their website. And then starting in 2024, cookware companies have to start listing it on the label, because currently if you go to buy a pan, number one, it's difficult sometimes to even figure out what the pan is made out of, let alone if it has PFAS in it. So some alternatives to these are to prepare meals at home, to limit the use of to-go food containers and fast food. Fast food is generally not a healthy choice anyway. Popcorn is very easy to make at home. I recommend it. We also want to think about using glass and stainless steel storage materials and using traditional cookware. So let's talk about water filters. So according to the EPA, these 3 different types of water filters filter out PFAS. So while they are currently assessing our water supply and, kind of gearing up for treating it, if you want to consider avoiding PFAS from your drinking water, these are some ways to do it. Activated carbon is the least effective, but the most cost efficient. It's important with this that you replace the water filters as directed, or they become too saturated with the heavy metals and components that they're filtering out and don't work as well. So I looked at the environmental working groups water filter recommendations and cross-referenced it with recommendations from Consumer Lab Reports. They recently put out a water filter guide, and they recommended the EPIC, the Brita as some of the best carbon treatment options. They also noted that the zero water filter pitcher was adding microplastics to the water. So that was a recommendation from Environmental Working Group that Consumer Lab came out and said, actually, that puts microplastics into the water. We don't recommend using this water pitcher. I'm mentioning this because it was devastating to me because I've been using that water pitcher for quite some time. So the ones listed here are ones that I would suggest based on these reports, but I think it's important to do your research and also cross-reference some of the information that's there. Additionally, the ion exchange treatment is very effective at removing PFAS. Consumer Lab Reports recommends the Berkey filter, which is also recommended by the Environmental Working Group. And there's also high pressure membranes. These are the ones that go under the sink. They take in a lot of water and also wastewater. So they're not the most environmentally sound option, but they do filter out greater than 90% of PFAS. So cookware. So Teflon and nonstick coating, it really requires a lot of little rules. You can't use metal for it. You're not supposed to heat the pan without anything in it that can degrade the coating. You shouldn't use oil cooking sprays on it. So no, Pam or aerosol avocado oil, because that can degrade it as well. And they can't be heated above 500 or the coating starts to smoke. So those are different ways that the coating does break down. These are some options for cookware. For ceramic, these 2 listed here were recommended by America's Test Kitchen as top picks and are good options if you're looking for something that has nonstick qualities. Taking good care of your metal pans can also yield good nonstick qualities as well. So that's something to think about. I think cookware really can last a lifetime if it's properly taken care of. And it is an investment, but it does last very well. I find that with nonstick pans, individuals tend to throw them out every few years after they're scratched or they notice that the coating is breaking down. And copper. So additionally, we want to think about not heating plastic because we know that heating plastic in the microwave or in the dishwasher can cause the components to break down and leach into the food and for the plastic to not be as stable. Packaged foods could also be of concern, as well as soap that uses fragrance. And this is because these things can cause exposure to phthalates. These are plasticizers. They're put in products because they increase the flexibility, the longevity of the plastic. And they're also in the fragrance containing soaps because they're a solvent and they can be used to carry and distribute the fragrance throughout the product. There's been some voluntary labeling of phthalate-free. You can also look for Prop 65 warnings. They've also been listed as reasonably anticipated to be carcinogens. And if you look at these recycling labels on the bottom of plastic containers, recycling label 3, also PVC piping, but recycling label 3 indicates that it may contain phthalates. Phthalates are completely banned in the European Union, Argentina, and other countries, but they're restricted in children's products here, but not banned. So I think some alternatives, to using plastic and heating plastic is to consider using glass and stainless steel storage materials. Also, I think about using fragrance-free soap and fragrance-free cleaning chemicals as good alternatives. Additionally, we want to think about limiting our use of cans and plastic bottles. Again, not heating plastic. And this means also, even if it says microwave safe or dishwasher safe, that doesn't mean BPA free or phthalate free. It just means it won't melt. So I think those are important considerations with plastics. Additionally, receipt paper, thermal paper that we get at the checkout line in the grocery store does contain BPA or similar chemicals. So BPA has been used in plastics since the 50s. It's used to coat the insides of cans to prevent the cans from breaking down and rusting. It's used in water lines. There's some voluntary labeling of it for BPA free. You've probably seen this. Since that started, there's alternatives. There's bisphenol S that's used as an alternative among others that may still carry some of the same health risks that BPA does. And it's been restricted in infant products like baby bottles, sippy cups, and things like that. And it's considered probably carcinogenic. So I think this is something to pay attention to. Alternatives to using the cans and plastic bottles are to consider using jarred food, jarred tomato sauce, for example, jarred peaches, or to consider even the Tetra Paks as an alternative to cans, and to consider that, as well as glass, stainless steel storage, porcelain, copper, and other containers. And BPA is considered an endocrine disruptor. It also has been a concern for childhood development, childhood behavior, and has been associated with increased risk of diabetes as well as cardiovascular disease. So I wanted to highlight this, this meta-analysis that came out last year. They looked at 16 different studies on human populations and analyzed different lifestyle interventions. The interventions range from a few days to years, but they looked at some of the things that we've been talking about today. And they found that adhering to these guidelines reduced urinary BPA and other endocrine disrupting metabolites. And there are other studies as well that have shown that adherence to this reduces the metabolites of the endocrine disrupting chemicals that we've been talking about. So in summary, we know that these can't be completely avoided, but restricting use of known sources may reduce concentrations in the body. I think there's a public health benefit to it as well as a planetary health benefit to it. I want to think about, a lot of folks get comfortable bringing their own grocery bags to the store, but also think about bringing cloth bags for your produce or glass or stainless steel containers, considering use of bulk food shopping, which kind of fell out of favor during the pandemic, but I think it's going to come back with use of more co-ops and potentially seeing some of the larger chain grocery stores bring that back as an option. When looking at plastic bottles, consider looking for the ones with recycling codes 1, 2, or 4. And then assessing your cookware, utensils, thinking about filtering your tap water. In addition to that, I think there's some benefit to consuming polyphenols in the diet from coffee, from green tea, from fruits and vegetables, and chocolate, and that may also be protective against the detrimental effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals. I wanted to share some resources as well. There are several zero waste stores scattered throughout the Los Angeles area. Some of them are like Sun, Moon, Rain in Santa Monica, RE Grocery, there's Pro-Stainable in Woodland Hills. You can kind of look these up and see what's available in your area, as well as the store selling the Luke bulk items. Keep an eye out for that as another option. There's public advocacy groups like the Environmental Working Group. That is a great resource for this topic. Recently, there was also the Endocrine Disrupting Chemicals and Women's Health Symposium. I put a link there to a YouTube link to their presentations. In addition to that, there's the book Countdown by Dr. Shanna Swan. It's been comparable to racial Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, which highlighted the effects of DDT on bird failure. And it talks about how the modern world is threatening sperm counts, altering male and female reproductive development. So that might be of interest. And then there's also the Endocrine Society Guide. That's
Okay, Megan,
what
thank
I
you so much.
have for today.
Thank you. I think we have a few minutes to take some questions. I have a few questions and I'll take some from the chat as well. Thank you so much. As you and I talked about, our goal was to try to share some of this information without creating anxiety disorders among myself and everyone in the room, because we don't want to view the whole world as a landmine, but obviously there are these concerns. I'm going to relate the first question that I see in the chat. So, and I think it's a nice practical one. What are the top 3 actions we should take, right? So if you have to, so we can't do it all, right? If we can't take on every single recommendation, what do you think would be the most impactful if we had to just choose 2 or 3 things?
I mean, I think we want to consider limiting our use of plastics in our household. And I think that's a big one. But looking at our food storage containers, what are we packing our lunch in? How are we storing our leftovers? Are we putting these in the dishwasher? So looking for alternatives to use in the home, things that you're using on a daily basis. I do think that filtering our tap water likely has value as well. While the EPA kind of gets it together and starts regulating this, it's going to take some time. And in addition to that, I do think that cooking at home does make a big impact on what we're being exposed to, because we know that I like eating out at restaurants too, but we know that when we eat out at restaurants, we lose a lot of control, or when we take food to go, we lose a lot of control of how it's packaged as well and what it's cooked in. So those are my top 3 takeaways of what I'm considering and how I'm incorporating these into my home. But it is easy to start feeling scared of everything that you're touching. Are you absorbing the BPA from the receipt paper that the cashier handed to you? Are you overtaking in too many of these? And what are the health effects of that?
So I have a couple more on this. There's something I see in the chat. And as you know, you and I don't rehearse these questions, so I'm always putting you on the spot. Okay, when I go to, let's say, Trader Joe's or Whole Foods, sometimes I'll see in one of the sections some kind of soap to wash off the pesticides in addition to water.
Mm-hmm.
How valuable or impactful do you think these products are?
Yeah, I usually actually recommend against them. And I'm biased in this way because my mother is a chemist and she used to work for a company that would make these chemicals and found that sometimes they were contaminated, and so that they weren't actually a value and that they could be adding bacteria when they're supposed to be taking it away. I think it's better to just use water, just rinse it off. I don't think you should be using any kind of detergent on it at all, and just use plain water. If you want to use a mixture of water and vinegar, diluted vinegar, to help further wash it, or you want to use a scrub brush on something like carrots or potatoes, I think that makes good logical sense. But I wouldn't use a vegetable washing spray. I think that's unnecessary.
Okay, I learned something new. Thank you. Another question from the chat. Somebody mentioned that perhaps the Berkeley filter is not allowed in California. And if that's the case, are there any glass bottle filter pitchers that you can recommend?
So the Berkey, it is depending on the size that you purchase, is my understanding. So I think they have a limit I think it goes up to maybe a 3 or 4 person per household limit on their item. I was reviewing it the other day. That is available in California, but I think the larger ones are not. And I think that I have to look back and see why that is, what regulatory issue is going on there for them not to allow it. I'm not familiar with any glass filters, but I am interested in that. If anyone here has one that they'd like to share with the group, that would be great.
And there are a couple of other questions about water filters, and I'm wondering, Megan, if we should dedicate an entire session to this, because and you and I haven't talked about this directly. I think there's a lot of nuance to this. On one hand, the reverse osmosis filters that Megan was alluding to, right? It will take nearly everything out that's harmful, most likely.
Mhm.
But you're also going to remove minerals that, we probably should be having in our diet, things like magnesium and other things that is naturally occurring in mineral water, for example. And it's really a difficult decision. I know there are a lot of decision trees and sorting through that. So maybe we'll have a session on water. We could add that to our list. And this is something you brought up, and I just want to bring it up again for clarification. If I'm listening to this, and let's say I'm 85, versus being, let's say, an 18, 19-year-old with, reproductive age ahead of me, or if I'm going to be pregnant. I mean, how would you shift the weight of these recommendations just based on where we are in our life cycle?
I mean, for some, I mean, I think, obstetricians tend to recommend that pregnant individuals, not dye their hair or go to nail
Right.
salons, and kind of follow these these guidelines a little bit more strictly because of the risk to the baby. But also, some endocrine disrupting chemicals have shown to have generational effects as well, which I think is really interesting. I mean, yes, I would definitely lax the recommendations for an older individual, but I do go back to the role of planetary health here as well in reducing plastic and reducing the production of PFAS and adding them to the environment by improper disposal, and really just not being able to do anything with these because they don't break down. So I think that that's an aspect of this that is worth consideration beyond the personal aspect.
And along those lanes, I want to, I'll give my answer. Somebody asked about, plastic water bottles. Personally, I don't think one should use them. Megan,
Agree.
agree. And part of it is also the environmental piece, right? But also just, we just don't know about how much of these endocrine disruptors, especially when you stick them in your car for, all summer long, and they're in the heat, and who knows how much, what degree of these endocrine disruptors are leaching into the water when it's in that kind of heat for a period of time.
Right. And I think we've been kind of conditioned to like reduce, reuse, recycle. And so I know a lot of folks kind of inappropriately reuse single use items that really shouldn't be reused again and again. They weren't made for that. And so the plastic does break down. So I think that's worth consideration too.
Great point. And maybe I'll take one more question from the chat. Is a coconut shell activated carbon filter preferred? We might take that during our water session, but do you have an easy answer now? I'm honestly not sure.
But I'm interested in looking into it.
Okay, so and then just a general point, this would be for Lachey. I know this, Lachey, this is recorded and we're going to have it posted. Are we sending a PDF of the slides to the participants that registered?
We can. I don't mind doing that.
Yeah, I was gonna say I could do that as well. No problem.
Okay, because I know for a lot of people, it's just hard to take notes on all the great information that you provided. Okay,
and
that would be great. So please do feel free. I know Lachey is going to be sending an evaluation form for feedback on perhaps other topics that would be useful. We're generating our own list internally as well. Again, these were meant to be, brief, concise sessions, just because I know we're all busy in our workday, and here we are in the afternoon, but we want to keep learning. I always learn from Megan, and I appreciate you all participating. So thank you, Megan, so much for, again, putting this together. To our audience, thank you all so much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
thank you. Thank you, everyone.